Hello there, my name is Eoin Sullivan. I'm a specialist in prosthodontics and I work in a specialist referral practice in Chelsea in central London. I've been a partner here at the No. 8 Partnership for the last 23 years and I've been using digital workflows for the last 12 years when I first got my first iTero scanner. So I have been a relatively early adapter to digital dentistry. I got my first intraoral scanner nearly 12 years ago. And my first scanner was an iTero scanner because they were the original to the market. And I've been using iTero scanners ever since. My journey with iTero began before Eoin's involvement with iTero. And I've always used it primarily as a restorative scanner, being a restorative dentist. And the reason I started using it was because I was very impressed with the levels of accuracy and the improvement in the outcomes that I was seeing when I started using digital scanning. Back in those days, the scanners were big, they were clunky, but they did take incredibly accurate scans. And what I noticed very quickly compared to taking traditional impressions was we had less remakes, less occlusal adjustment, and the fit and predictability of the restorations was already a step forward compared to using traditional impressions. Now, it should be noted that back then, digital workflows were not what they are today. And although we were taking digital impressions, and we were getting iTero milled models made because it predated 3D printing, the restorations were still being made using traditional analog methods. And yet, despite this, there was a significant improvement in the fit and accuracy of the restorations compared to those made on traditional impressions. So it started from there. Over the years, obviously, things have developed and our technician colleagues have moved on hugely and they've developed all kinds of new digital workflows for making restorations, new materials for making restorations from. And that has flowed very nicely with the development of the clinical digital techniques. And so now we have a huge array of new techniques and new methods for restoring our patients' teeth. When I started using the intraoral scanner, the iTero was the only one on the market. Shortly thereafter, the company was bought out by Eoin, and Eoin in those days was primarily focused on orthodontics and maybe didn't focus so much on the restorative dentistry. So people don't traditionally know iTero as a restorative scanner, but originally that's what it was. And a few years back, when my original scanner started getting a bit tired, I started looking at the rest of the market to see what other scanners were available. And although technology had moved on, the quality of the scans had not necessarily moved on compared to the original scanner. And I was somewhat disappointed, expecting something much better, until I discovered that iTero had also moved on with their scanners and were producing newer scanners which brought the same quality of the original scanner but in a much more usable package. The size of the handpiece had reduced dramatically, the weight of it had reduced dramatically, and the ease at which you take scans had changed. And this has been a real game changer, so that it's now become something that's much more applicable and much more usable in practice. At the same time, digital workflows have developed hugely, and there are far more things that you can do with this digital information. And so now it's become an essential tool in my practice that I use in every aspect of my practicing day. So people often ask me, well, what do you use a scanner for? It seems like a very expensive thing just to take impressions with. And one of the points I'd really like to make is that an intraoral scanner is much more than just an impression-taking device. It's a communication tool, it's a planning tool, it's a means of carrying out treatment, it's a means of monitoring progress. There's so many different ways that I use it within my practice that, as I say, it's become one of the most essential tools that I have. So let me start with talking about communication. taking an intraoral scan of your patient and being able to share that scan with your patient, to my amazement, has turned out to be one of the most powerful communication tools I've ever had. I've always taken lots of photographs of my patients. I've always tried to share them with my patients. I'm a very visual-based person, and I've always tried to explain treatment using photographs. And I found patients kind of look at it, but I've never found that they really engage that well with it. However, if you sit a scan down in front of a patient, a little bit like this, and you start allowing the patient to play with it and manipulate it, one of the first things that happens is the patient starts nudging you out of the way and starts manipulating the scan themselves. They're used to using iPads and things like that, and they start playing around with it, and they'll start doing things like this and go, oh, hey, I didn't realize my tooth looked like this. I didn't realize it. And suddenly they engage with their own mouths far more than I've ever seen them engage with anything else. So from a communication point of view, trying to explain to patients what's going on, it's incredibly powerful. In fact, it unloads a whole lot of questions on their part because they're very, very curious about seeing their own mouth in 3D. So from that point of view, as a communication tool with our patients, it's excellent. As a diagnostic tool, it is also very useful, both from the point of view of being able to see what the patient's teeth are like, and also being able to explain to the patient in turn what it's all about, but also with the advent of near infrared technology, which allows us to view the tooth, look through the enamel and look for any imperfections in the enamel. We diagnose caries perhaps earlier than we might radiographically. It also helps in terms of visualizing cracks or any other defects in the teeth. So again, it gives us a further diagnostic tool that we did not have before. In terms of planning, what I'm able to do with these scans is I'm able to share them with the laboratory. We can do digital wax-ups. We can interact with the laboratory myself, sharing it virtually, so I don't actually have to physically go to the laboratory. So it allows me to plan treatment, but then also once I've made a plan, I can then easily share that with the patient, oftentimes by Zoom. In these days of post-COVID, patients are quite keen not to have to come visit us so often, so being able to do things virtually is very helpful. So I will often share my plans with the patient, and again, with them being able to look at the thing in 3 dimensions, I find patients are much more able to understand what's going on and follow the treatment, and most importantly from our perspective, agree to the treatment. Other useful aspects of this is in terms of record keeping. Some of my colleagues who use scanners don't even do chartings anymore because they kind of go, why would I do a charting when I've got a perfect 3D rendering of the patient's mouth with everything in place? Certainly I find having these records and having them permanently on the cloud available to me at any time is a really useful tool. For example, you have a patient of yours who goes off and falls over and has a trauma and breaks their front teeth, and you think, wow, it would be really helpful if I could have had a record of what their teeth were like before the trauma. Well, the fact that I scan all of my patients means I have exactly that, and I can call upon that record at any time and use that to help me restore the patient's teeth back to the way they were. So there are many useful tools that come out nearly as a secondary of doing your intraoral scan. So one of the things I find really helpful with intraoral scanning is that when you're providing treatment for patients, let's say you're doing a crown preparation, in the traditional workflows, if there was a problem with the impression, we often didn't know about it until the lab phones you up a day or so later saying, that impression you sent me, there was a drag on the impression, or there was some inaccuracy in the impression, and you've got the embarrassing situation of having to call your patient back in and say, I need to retake the impression. Well, one of the big benefits with taking digital scans is you get to see, in essence, the virtual model while the patient is still in place. You can check, have you taken off enough of the occlusion? You can check, is the prep entirely clear while the patient is still there? And if there's an issue, you can correct it while the patient is there without needing to get the patient back. So let me just give you a little demonstration here. This is a patient who we are preparing for some crowns, and the fact that at the end of the scanning process I'm able to see in 3D exactly what way the preps are, where the margins are, make sure they're clear. I can even check the occlusion to make sure that I've taken off enough from the occlusion. If we get rid of the lower model, we can check, is there sufficient occlusal clearance for the restorations that we have? And it just makes everything much more predictable, because I can totally check, is my scan perfect while the patient is there? And if it's not perfect, I can make those corrections. So let's say I haven't cut off enough off my prep, I can modify that little bit and correct it. And the really nice thing with an intraoral scan is I don't have to redo the entire scan. I can just correct that one little bit. I can rub that little bit out on the scan and add the corrected part into it without having to redo the whole thing. So it is a hugely useful tool from that point of view, and it means that the technician will always get the perfect scan and will always get the best material to work with. As part of that, one of the things that it does really, really well, provided you do it properly, is it records the patient's occlusion very, very accurately. So I have less issues then with either the lab articulating the models incorrectly or something going wrong along the way, which then requires me to do much more occlusal adjustment when the restorations come back. So the fact that I'm sending a perfect scan with a perfect bite record, and I know nothing's going to go astray, nothing's going to get warped in the post or broken or lost or anything like that, the technician gets the correct material to work with, and therefore they have the best chance of creating the best restoration for me, which results, when I get it back, in minimal adjustment, if any, and the best outcomes for our patient. So it improves predictability, it reduces the number of times you have to do remakes, or you have to get the patient back to redo impressions or change anything like that. So from that point of view, that alone is an enormous benefit, particularly as you're doing more and more complex cases. In terms of communication with the laboratory, digital workflows really move things on to a new level. The fact that you take your scan and it gets sent immediately to the laboratory means you're not having to physically go and send lab work to them. There isn't anybody needing to collect anything. It's there straight away with the technician. You can discuss the case with the technician. They can start working on the case, but they can also share what they're doing with you. So I have an arrangement with my laboratory that every step of the process, they share with me what they're doing and get my approval before they move on to the next stage. This is really important with very complex cases where you don't want any misunderstanding or any unpredictable elements to it. By using ExoCAD, our laboratory is able to export the scans directly into the software, and then they can do a thing called a web share, where each step of the process they can share it with me. All they do is send me a little email. I've got a link, and I can then look in 3 dimensions at exactly what they're doing, and I can suggest modifications, or I can agree it, or whatever needs to be done to be able to then get the best outcome for my patient. This takes away that terrible unpredictability of not knowing quite what you're going to get back from the lab, because you've been able to double check each step of the way. And so it means that when it comes to fitting restorations for my patients, I've got far less surprises, which makes life easier, but it also means I've got far less adjustment to do, and the outcomes are much more predictable than they ever were using analog workflows. One of the questions I often get asked is, how does using the iTero scanner impact on the clinical outcomes of my treatments? And one of the things that I would say is that the accuracy of the scans and the fact that we're using a completely digital workflow with using very little in terms of physical models except for final finishing and for layering of porcelain, means that there's far less potential for error. This in turn means that when it comes to delivering treatment for my patient, I very rarely have to adjust anything. We tend to have perfect fits all the time, and the occlusion tends to be very accurate. So in terms of predictability and the need for remakes, this is very much diminished. It also, with the digital workflows, because I can check each step of the way, I can interact with the laboratory and make sure that they're making what I'm expecting them to make. And so it improves the communication between the laboratory and myself, and vice versa, so that we can optimize our outcomes for our patients. The other thing that digital workflows are really good at doing is copying information. So for example, if I have designed a set of provisional restorations, particularly with a given occlusal scheme, and I want to accurately reproduce that in the next set of restorations, one of the things that digital workflows allow you to do is to precisely copy what you've had before and transfer that into the design of the restoration. Scanning for restorative case with the iTero scanner is where we start seeing the real potential of what the iTero scanner can do. So when you use the scanner for a restorative case, it has a specific menu of steps that you do. So it makes it very user-friendly from your point of view. And so what we start off with by doing is taking a scan of the opposing occlusion, so we know what the restoration needs to occlude against. You can, if for example there are aspects of the way the tooth is before you restore it that you'd like to reproduce in your final restoration, you can also take a pre-treatment scan of the patient's tooth before you start preparing it. You then go ahead and carry out your tooth preparation. And once your tooth preparation is completed, you can then take a scan of that arch that has the preparation in it as a sort of an overview scan. And then you follow that up with a high definition detail scan of the actual preparation itself. And that picks up all of the very accurate, fine detail, high definition information of the actual prep and the adjacent teeth. And then you finish off by doing a bite record or an interocclusal scan so that the computer knows how to fit together the two sets of scan data so that we accurately reproduce the occlusion. Now when it comes to doing the high definition scan for the tooth preparation, obviously because it's an optical impression technique, we need to be able to see really well all the aspects of the tooth preparation. So ensuring that you get your preparation perfectly dry, that you've got very good moisture control, but also soft tissue control is really, really important. So there are certain techniques and knacks that you need to have in order to be able to do that very predictably. And so the technique that I personally use is I use a double cord retraction technique. And so I will place my cords, and then just before, when I place the two cords as I finalize my preparation, and when I do my overview scan, I have the two cords still in place. And the purpose of the overview scan is so that the computer knows where to put the high detail, the high definition scan into place in the overall scan. So when it then comes time to get the high definition scan, I take out one of the retraction cords, and that opens up the sulcus so that we can see exactly where the margin is, and we can see down into the sulcus and record the area beyond the preparation margin. Now, sometimes if there's any kind of inflammation or the tissues are not cooperating, then I will also use some retraction paste. There are various ones on the market, but you use those just to inject that into that sulcus, just to open it up a little bit more and to control any bleeding or anything like that that might be happening. And I leave that in place for a couple of minutes, and then we wash that off, dry it all off, and that always gives you the perfect soft tissue scenario to then be able to scan. So just by paying attention to detail of those little bits means that you will always get a very predictable scan, because you've got all of that under control by the time you do your high definition scan. And if you follow that protocol, I find you always get very predictable outcomes. What are the advantages of digital impressions over analog impressions? Well, there are many. From some points of view, from the patient's point of view, the biggest advantage is you don't have a big mouthful of gunge. So I find patients tolerate it far better than conventional impressions, and particularly patients who maybe are a bit claustrophobic or who gag very easily, I found that patients that I could never take a conventional impression of, I can quite easily scan. The other advantage is, having taken my digital impression, I can examine the scan without having to have that traditional problem that you have with an analog impression, where you think you've taken a lovely impression and then the lab phones you up and says, oh, I think there's a distortion or there's a drag or there's some problem, and then you've got to get the patient back to have another impression. So it takes all of that out of the equation, because you can fully see the scan when it's completed and check it and make sure you have all the detail that you want. It also allows you to do things like analyze, have you taken away enough tooth structure for the given type of restoration that you want to make. So you can check the occlusion, you can see there is a color-coded system that allows you to see how much tooth structure you've taken away and whether you need to modify the prep. And then should you need to make a modification, you can modify just that little bit. And one of the nice things is you then don't have to redo the whole scan, you can just rescan the little part that was modified and correct it that way. Because there's nothing to bend or distort or displace, you tend not to have any issues with distortions in the models. And also because the restorations are made from the digital information rather than a physical model, it takes away a number of potential errors that can crop in to an analog workflow, which would then later mean that the restoration needs quite a bit of modification. So as a result of that, everything becomes much more predictable, and that in turn means the restorations that I get back tend to need far less modification or adjustment than I found back in the days of analog impressions. Now, what are the limits? What can't you do with a digital impression? Well, the limits are quite few, really. I tend to use digital impressions for nearly everything. Perhaps the one thing that I don't use it for denture repairs. That's where you go back to your traditional impressions, just because it's a bit quicker and a bit easier. But I do use digital impressions for making dentures. Certainly tooth-supported dentures, like chrome cobalt dentures, work beautifully using digital workflows. The only area that you can't do, because by physical definition, a digital scan is an optical impression and not a and therefore mucostatic, and not a physical impression where it may be mucocompressive. So when it comes to making full dentures or dentures of extensive edentulous areas where you need to have a mucocompressive impression, you can't do that digitally. However, that doesn't mean I don't use digital in a lot of the workflow for that. So what I tend to do, or what I've developed over time, is a sort of a hybrid workflow where I will take the primary impressions digitally, and I'll get the special trays or the tooth mock-ups or whatever we need to do made on a digital workflow, and then the secondary mucocompressive impression we do using special trays that have been made from that original digital information. So digital workflows allow me to provide treatment in a much more predictable and efficient way than analog ones allowed us to do. Why is that? Because by being able to plan everything in a lot of detail before we ever start the treatment, and by being able to communicate very effectively with the patient, often without the patient even physically needing to be in the office, because I can do that virtually, I am able to have a much more detailed plan before we start the treatment, but also because I can get the technicians to precisely follow that plan, and because I get such accurate impressions from our digital scans, and because I can evaluate those scans at the time of taking them, I tend to not need to get the patients back for appointments for taking more impressions, or I tend not to have remakes in the same way as you might have had to have done before, and I'm able to focus on getting the patient's treatment done to a much higher standard than I ever did before, but with far less appointments. So from that point of view, this is an enormous step forward. So digital impressions have been around for a long time, and over the years more and more applications of that digital information have come along that allow you to use your scans in far more ways than we could before. The big game changer has been the advent of exocad, which is a piece of software that the laboratory use to fabricate restorations, and it's a CAD program. And of late there has been far more integration between iTero and exocad, which means that my scans now go straight into the exocad software. So from the laboratory's point of view, it means there's less, it's a much more smooth and streamlined workflow, but it also brings a whole bunch of features that we can use that we didn't have before. So an example is the Smile Creator software, which allows us to carry out smile design for our patients. It allows us to combine photographs and the 3D scans of our patients so that we can create virtual mock-ups, and I can share that with the patient, but it just allows for much more of a back and forth and communication between the laboratory and myself, so that we can plan cases far better than we could before. What would happen if my iTero scanner suddenly disappeared? I'd be lost. It's become such an integral part of what I do that I would really struggle if I didn't have access to a scanner. I use it for every aspect of the patients and the care that I give to my patients, and so at this point in time, it's such an essential tool that I don't think I'd actually be able to function without it.